Hello and welcome to another episode of Project Sanity. I'm your host, Richard, aka Progressive Greens, and with me I have a couple delegates and several other guests joining me. I just want to start off again, welcome you. This is Benjamin Dixon channel. This is Project Sanity. And if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. We're going to be talking about today, we're going to cover some headlines of breaking news. We're going to be talking about the state convention, specifically Washington State, and we're going to mention some of the other state conventions. And we're going to be talking about what's going on in California with the count. And Dave's also got some great reporting of the People's Summit, just some highlights if you missed them. And then we're going to end today with a conversation on gun control and what that means and where we have a variety of opinions on between us on the show, so you're going to be treated to a great debate about where we can go from gun control and the gun debate in general. So, but off the top, what I wanted to start with was just some headlines. One of the headlines that's come out recently is that the third officer out of 6 in the Freddie Gray trials has been acquitted of all charges, and apparently the reporting goes on to detail Baltimore. Or WBAL TV has a great up-to-the-minute updates, or most recent updates as far as how things have progressed up until this point. But basically, what they said, the judge said, was that they did not prove that he either didn't that there was any malice or that they intentionally were negligent, or that any of the charges stuck. And it was the driver. Today, his name is, let me just pull it up here so I make sure I get it right here. It's Cesar Goodson, and he had the toughest charges, including the manslaughter charge, and he again was acquitted of all of those charges. And we might have some time to talk about it in some more detail. Another story that came out that I want to make sure that people are aware of. It's out of The Intercept, and I'm just pulling it up for us here now. And basically, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and local police have been knocking on the doors of activists and community organizers in the Cleveland, Ohio area, asking about whether they have any plans for the Republican National Convention, any activities that they may be aware of, or any information that they can basically dime out any people that they may be aware of to the authorities. And again, it was the FBI, Homeland Security, and police have all been doing it, and I believe they confirmed the FBI confirmed that they had been interviewing people, because it was originally just reports from people that had been getting interviewed, and there was at least a dozen people that have come forward saying that they've been questioned. And essentially, the law enforcement is saying that this is community outreach, working with the community in order to try to prevent any problems. But there's been a lot of static regarding what kind of protests are going to be allowed outside or near the Republican National Convention, and between activists and local authorities. And so this seems to be an attempt to try to nip it in the bud. Before the show, we had some conversations, and I'll let Brandon expand on it further in a moment. But essentially, that there may be something along the lines of a list going on. Are these people on a list? Like, how did these people come to the FBI or Homeland Security's attention, and that these are people in Cleveland, Ohio that we want to talk to? And that's caused some more questions. But the reporting is on The Intercept by Alice Sperry. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, Alice. But go ahead and check it out. It's great reporting, and we'll have the link in the description after the show for sure. Before I go any further, I did want to bring in Brandon, who's got some other news that's been going on that also pertains a bit towards what we're going to be discussing later in the show. So let me just get Brandon up here for us all. Welcome, Brandon.
Oh, thank you, Richard. Nice to see you again.
And so, for those of you wondering, Nis is not available today. He's traveling. He's in travel back from Denmark, but he will be here next week. So if you're looking for him, he will be here next week. Later on, excuse me, where Benjamin's not going to be in today. So I don't know why I am totally blanking on her name right now. Anoa, sorry, I don't know why that blank. Her name in Slack is different, so I kept wanting to say her Slack name. But Anoa is going to be hosting for Ben today, and so I just wanted to mention that for folks that that comes on at 6. But before that, again, Brandon, let us know some of the stories that you had pulled together for us.
Well, you brought up the Cleveland Republican National Convention and the sort of hoopla going around surrounding that. And the reason why is because this is going to be one of the first national conventions where guns are allowed near the convention. They have gone through the trouble of banning things like water guns and swords and soapboxes and sleeping bags, but they have been unable to ban guns or people open carrying or concealed carrying guns due to Ohio's very lax gun legislation. So there is a fear that people will be bringing guns with them to the protest.
Interesting. That's that. I could see. I know that there's with Trump supporters and the conflicts that have been arising outside of those events. There's been like a lot of questions and concerns about whether people have been getting pepper sprayed at several events, not just by the police, but also by either attendees of the Trump events or Trump attendees getting caught in the crossfire of police and or possibly coming from the protesters. So if we escalate that to guns, it seems as though that could be cause for more concern out in Cleveland. So it's curious that they've been able to ban some of these other things that have had issues already, but that guns aren't gone.
Well, the police are gearing up already to combat perceived problems with this law and the fact that they cannot ban guns from around the air from the protest area in general. So they've already received a grant of a few $1 million. They've already received some paramilitary equipment in order to put down a theoretical armed protest. So it's the Republican National Convention just might turn into a war zone, a literal war zone as opposed to a more metaphorical war zone this year.
Yeah, and I'm not sure everybody's going to know who the right people are to shoot at, which sounds dangerous. So hopefully it doesn't come to that, and it's the protests are peaceful. But I know Trump has already suggested that he's going to have an unconventional convention, so it should be there's possibilities for many things to arise throughout the event. And it seems as though with his most recent speech he's been able to stabilize his Republican support and kind of put to bed the rumors of basically an insurrection at the Republican National Convention regarding trying to oust Trump as the nominee. There was a last-minute effort made by, I think, a handful of delegates, and it seems as though his most recent speech has quelled some of that. So now, given 2 weeks or any weeks is a long time with Donald Trump for him to say or do something that could change everything. But it seems as though he's aiming towards being able to have the majority of Republican support so that there shouldn't be any problems within the convention, is what it seems.
Well, there are some constraints being placed on the protesters and what they are and are not allowed to do. So, as per usual, there is a sort of protest-free zone in between where they're allowed to protest and where the actual convention is taking place, as well as the fact that they are only allowed to protest between the hours of 9 p.m. and 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. You have to file ahead of time as a group if you want to protest. Already, 30 groups have already filed a petition to protest, and so there does seem to be a multitude of people who are going to be there with different interests, all with different sort of viewpoints in relation to the Republican National Committee or party.
Yes, and we've seen at least reports from some of Trump's events where some of his more ardent supporters or more vocal supporters have gone out of their way to confront protesters beyond those exclusion zones that they create around the protests. So it's very possible that something could still erupt depending on how well thought out and how well executed the planning is of the local police regarding maintaining control over that, and then how well they are or how good of a job they do at estimating how many people are actually going to show up to these things.
Well, I mean, in a situation where you have concealed carry and just hundreds and hundreds of protesters, I mean, how well can you really prepare? I guess is my question. Like, what can you really do besides prepare for the worst case scenario, which is a multi-party shootout But I mean, I pray that that's not the case. But that seems to be what they're not expecting, but that's what they're gearing up for in terms of riot gear and all other sorts of preparations that you don't normally see at a political convention.
And perhaps, I mean, with your background in the social sciences, perhaps you can shed some more light on this. But is about the notion that gearing up in that way, showing up in riot gear, and with heavily armored vehicles or some of the other things that we can imagine they would be there that we've seen in places like Ferguson or Baltimore. How that goes psychologically to escalate a situation rather than de-escalate. Is there any validity to that, or can you speak on that?
Well, I mean, absolutely. Both you can speak to the idea of having that sort of that sort of equipment makes you want to use it. So we talk about the militarization of the police force is not simply getting the gear, but the sort of mentality that comes when you do get the gear, that you want to use it. There have been studies that show that when you carry when you carry a concealed weapon, you're more likely to use that concealed weapon. Not necessarily because you need to, but because you feel as though you might need to. So the same applies to cops. When you give them new toys, they want to use them. At the same time, simply having them there, that sort of presence, might escalate things. I mean, it's an assumption of violence on the part of the protesters to have people in riot gear there. So I
Is
can't.
yeah, how would you balance that, or how would you think that could be balanced with the idea that if they aren't, if they don't show up prepared for that, that then if something happens, that people are going to look at them and ask, well, how could you not have been prepared for this? Is it
Uh,
like how do you think that you can one can balance that, or the local forces could balance that?
uh, you don't allow guns there in the first place. You say that that we have a space for peaceful protest, and just having guns here, just having guns with you while you protest, automatically disqualifies you from peaceful protest because that is a aggressive move. Carrying a gun with you to a protest, if it's open carry, is aggressive. It's an aggressive move. I think that it's fair to say that if you ban guns from a protest, it's not because of any other reason than that protest becomes non-peaceful based on the presence of guns.
And
So, yeah.
or I was just gonna say, I remember it was something Stone or something, but there was some heated protests between some people of color and like a white supremacy. I don't know if they identified specifically with that, but some sort of white nationalist type group, and there was like basically opposing protests. I can't. Maybe somebody. I'll look around and see if anybody's able to pull it up for us. But essentially, there's a picture that ended up on Twitter of basically a cop in between a guy, one of the white nationalist protesters, or presumably, basically with his gun looking as though he might be ready to draw it, and the cop basically pushing like calming the protester down, as opposed the person that he was presumably going to aim the gun at rather than the person with the gun. And I think what everybody thought was if that situation were reversed, or if it was a person of color that had an open carry gun, and that there was a point of conflict, that the person of color with that open carry gun would be the one that would be more likely to get the police's attention rather than the person that was perhaps saying whatever it was that made him feel as though he needed to be more aggressive.
Well, I mean, that comes from the assumption of black people as criminals, or the criminalization of black people, or the racialization of criminals. So that blacks are criminals or potential criminals, and criminals tend to be black. But a more apt comparison would say the Oregon militia when they occupied the national park. What turned that from a peaceful sit-in to a violent occupation was the presence of guns. So, I mean, what turned the protest from peaceful to a riot is just the potential for violence. And that's sort of guns as being a symbol of violence and a symbol of aggression, and having no place in peaceful discourse.
Yeah, I think I think that to me that seems like the most sensible solution is not allowing any guns within the area at all, as to avoid all conflict. It's not like outside of these areas you're free to carry. And I mean, I don't know if does that create some sort of situation where a comedian, I can't remember which one, described it with the club, uh, that that you stand outside of the club because nobody got in with a gun, so everybody coming out is unarmed.
I guess, but I mean, I would also say the sort of the presence of militarized police force feeds into that sort of narrative that the reason why these people need guns is because the government is trying to suppress them in the first place. So like you sort of see the narrative being created by both sides to feed this sort of necessary this sort of justification for guns in the first place.
I
So
think.
like the police.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that I think that's actually a really great point as about how both sides feed into each other, and I think that'll carry into our later discussion about guns and what's happening or not happening regarding regulation and resolving gun violence. But continue your point. Sorry.
Yeah. So the police are geared up with their military equipment because they suspect that many of the protesters will be carrying guns, either openly or concealed. And the protesters are showing up under the impression, under the sort of anti-social, anti-state impression, uh, that the police are there with their military gear to put them down because they're not part of like because they're speaking out against the system. And so, I mean, they're creating the story that themselves. They're acting out their parts perfectly in this situation.
Yeah, and I was just looking in the back, and I see that we had a comment from David Martin, and mentioned that the Black Panthers were infiltrated in the '60s, and that agitators and the FBI will probably be posing as Bernie supporters as well. And we saw that in Baltimore, we saw that in Ferguson, we've seen that in multiple protests that have just been happening, that have been in headlines recently, that there have been undercover officers placed among the protesters, and in some cases, at least allegations of them instigating violence. So not only like as going back to your point about feeding into each other, that they take this opportunity of a gathering of people and stir up violence or emotion within that group, so then they can turn around and point back at them and see they're acting just like we told you they would.
Yeah, but I mean, we see that with terrorist activity too in FBI. They're creating the problem to justify their own existence there. So the FBI is creating the problem by entrapping people, giving them the tools to become terrorists in order to justify their funding, justify these overreaches of government. And the police are creating these riots in a lot of situations, either by showing up with riot gear to a place that might not be a riot otherwise. So like by showing up in riot gear, you create the environment of a riot, at least on one side of it. You create the conditions for a riot. The police are already there in riot gear, preparing for a riot. Where or like you mentioned right now, that they put plants in the crowd to sort of stoke the flames that eventually lead to the riot under the guise of, I guess, investigation or undercover detective work.
Yeah, no, and just what you triggered a thought in my mind as far as like how it's gone about and how it plays out, and I'll recapture it in a moment. But I did want to mention that that Lakeisha Rankin also mentioned that there were also allegations of Massachusetts and Michigan and North Carolina of people infiltrating Bernie camps and basically discouraging organization of campaign. And I know I've seen some examples of that. I don't know. I can't confirm or deny that the person had nefarious intentions or if they were just incompetent, but that there were several issues throughout the country that people were running into regarding some of that. And in order to run a campaign, I think the Bernie campaign also had to reach out to a lot of establishment people. And so when you do that, some of them may smile to your face, but in other points be doing things that aren't necessarily working in your favor. So infiltration, I think, is to be expected at this point, and that we can't assume that anything that happens is as it's described. And I mean, I personally have a skepticism, and I've heard it characterized elsewhere that it used to be more commonplace to be skeptical of whatever the police say happened, not to just take that as a statement of fact. That seems to be what the media has been doing more recently, and that a lot of people do in general, is that, well, whatever the police say, well, that's obviously the fact, and then these other stories are speculation. When really, in most situations, the police's report is no less speculation than the witness that or victim or other people engaged in the whatever situation that transpired.
Well, of course, because the police are not objective, and that it comes down to really being fair to the cops and saying, well, the cops are people. They have one interpretation of events from their point of view, and how you get, and it's kind of a logical fallacy, but I'll say anyway, how you get the real events is through is through a confluence of different narratives, different points of view. So you say, what does the cop say happened? What does a witness say says happened? What does the perpetrator or potential criminal say happened? And then you sort of cobble together a story from those events. You know, you have to be open to counter narratives when you hear about police, anything involving police or authority figures. That authority doesn't necessarily mean innocence or objectivity or some sort of rational view of the world. Sometimes it just means that they are attempting to paint a picture of events that keeps them in authority. So it doesn't delegitimize them as authority figures.
Yeah, and that was actually reminding me of what you were talking about regarding showing up in riot gear and stuff. And that I can't pull a study out of the top of my hat, but I do remember that there are. And you should be. I imagine you can confirm this for me. But basically, that when somebody's in a costume, it also it provokes that relationship. So if somebody's dressed like a pharmacist or a doctor, or somebody's dressed like whatever is popular for whatever it may be, a cop, that you then interact with that person as that costume or whatever that costume per se. And it's not until you get enough context clues that they may or may not be what they're presenting as that the nature of that interaction changes.
I mean, yeah, I'm sure there have been plenty of studies about that, but for me, this is more of like when you're a hammer, everything is a nail. So when you show up to an event in riot gear, and you are presented with a group of people who are separated from you not only by your little riot gear mask, but also by the sort of social connotations of we're the police, they're the police, what we say goes. If they don't follow us, like they're in the wrong. A riot is more likely to happen. It's just because you're already prepared for it. If you've already showed up with your hammer and you see a bunch of, maybe screws will fall instead of nails, and you hammer anyway. you go. They resemble a riot close enough, and you're already in your riot costume. So why not? The riot's happening. Like it's happening already.
Yeah,
Like,
and I guess what I'm suggesting is that then there's also kind of an implicit suggestion to the people there that they are rioters. Just like in relationships, is often saying, if you're going to accuse me of it so many times, I might as well be doing it, and so essentially that there may be some sort of psychological effect of they already consider me a rioter. They're treating me as if I'm just on the verge of rioting. Why shouldn't I riot? I
that's
mean,
I mean, of course, but also there's this psychological effect of what if they do have guns? Like, what if there are people out there in the crowd who do have guns, who so they're a little bit more paranoid about the potential of gun violence, and they do start shooting. I mean, that's another sort of potentiality that occurs when you just you know allow for more powder to be put into the keg of violence. Like what we're talking about is just like how much potential for violence is there in this situation. You have civilians who are allowed to be armed and don't have to be trained, don't have to be ex-law enforcement, ex-military, and you have cops who are carrying military equipment and are sort of within our system given carte blanche to put down threats. I mean, as you said, the Freddie Gray cop just got off, and all it takes is a little spark. So it comes down to minimizing the potential for violence.
yeah, I think that's something that the United States is long done battle with, is finding that line between freedom and safety. And there's also been some news from the NSA I meant to mention, but I didn't get a chance to pull up an article specifically, but about warrantless searches of internet traffic and of your history and of those types of things. And so we end up uh, and we'll see more of this leanings in our gun debate, but that we have a hesitance to sacrifice freedom for security. And
Well,
so, but I think in situations like this, I think that there's a very rational and reasonable approach that finds a reasonable balance. But I think that things are so polarized, so heated at the moment that middle ground is being what's the word I'm looking for? Is being conceded for a more extreme position on either
well,
side.
Well, I mean, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit there. I'm going to push back
Okay.
because I think the difference between freedom and security is largely a false one and kind of a specious one that is used by one side to justify why they need something. But we're not talking about the difference between freedom or security. We're talking about the difference between different types of freedom and different types of security. The reason why people are carrying guns is not because they want to be free, it's because they want to be secure. The reason why people don't want people to be carrying guns is because, or for example, don't be, is so they can be free to exist in society without the threat of being shot by someone, uh, for any variety of reasons. So security and freedom are being mobilized on both sides differently. So they're just different. These are just competing definitions of freedom and security we're talking about. So you have the gun owners who want the freedom to carry guns because it makes them feel more secure. You have the anti-gun people who want the freedom to exist in public without having to be afraid that someone will violate their security because they have a gun, because they're allowed to carry a gun. So I think people are prone to quoting the Second Amendment, but the Second Amendment means what you want it to mean.
No,
It's
I think you bring up a very interesting point, and I think again in our debate about guns later in the show, I think Brandon also brings a great perspective there as far as we seem to be missing some of the more important aspects of the arguments that we're having, and so. You had some other news stories. If you want to get through them very quickly, we talked for a bit. That's mostly my fault, but I do got to get Dave in here next. So, you had a couple other stories.
they're mostly related to guns, but we should probably come back to them when we talk about the gun bills failing in the Senate. So we should probably come back to them after we talk about guns.
Absolutely. Excellent. Now let me just check on Dave. I think